Hands where I can see them, now. The voice cut through the steady hum of diesel engines and the soft hiss of rain against metal, sharp enough to turn heads across the rest stop. Danielle Brooks froze with her hands still resting on the steering wheel, the dashboard lights casting a low amber glow across her fingers. Outside, red and blue reflections rippled across puddles on the asphalt, stretching and breaking with every passing gust of wind. The smell of wet concrete and fuel hung heavy in the air. She didn't move right away, not because she was afraid, but because timing mattered. It always did. A flashlight beam sliced through the side window, too bright, too close, forcing her to narrow her eyes. Another beam followed, crossing the first like searchlights in a prison yard. Boots crunched on gravel. Radios murmured in clipped, coded bursts. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine idled low, steady, like a heartbeat refusing to speed up. Danielle exhaled slowly, her breath fogging faintly in the cool night air inside the cab. She raised her hands, deliberate, controlled, placing them where they could be seen. No sudden movements. No wasted energy. The driver's door handle rattled once, then again, more forcefully this time. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his tone flatter now, but no less commanding. Danielle turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him through the glass. Tall, white, rigid posture, the kind of presence that assumed authority before it was ever questioned. Behind him, two more silhouettes shifted under the flashing lights, their outlines distorted by rain and reflection. Backup, of course. The rest stop had gone quiet in that subtle, almost unnatural way that happens when something feels off, but no one wants to say it out loud. A man near the vending machines paused mid-step. A woman by the gas pumps held her phone just a little higher than before. Eyes were watching. Always watching. Danielle reached for the door latch, slow enough to be intentional, steady enough to be unreadable. The metal clicked under her fingers, loud in the silence that had settled over the scene. As the door creaked open, a rush of cool air swept in, carrying the sharp scent of rain and asphalt. She stepped down onto the ground, boots landing softly against the wet surface, her posture upright, her expression calm. The officer's flashlight shifted from her hands to her face, lingering there as if searching for something already decided. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't speak, just met the moment with the same quiet stillness she carried mile after mile across empty highways. Somewhere behind the lights and the noise, something unseen had already started moving, and she knew it. Rain continued to fall in a steady rhythm, tapping against the hood of the truck and sliding down the chrome edges in thin, trembling lines. Danielle stood beside the open door, her hands still visible, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even. Up close, the night felt colder, sharper, every sound carrying farther than it should. The officer stepped closer, boots pressing into the wet gravel, his flashlight now lowered just enough to study her without the glare. His name tag caught a flicker of red and blue light, the letters briefly readable before fading again. Ryan Cole. Danielle noticed everything. Always had. The habit had been built over years of long highways, quiet miles, and conversations that taught her when to speak and when silence carried more weight. "License and registration," he said, his voice controlled but edged with something else, something less patient than procedure required. Danielle gave a small nod, turning carefully, reaching back into the cab with slow, deliberate movement. The interior still held the warmth of her body, the faint scent of coffee from a paper cup resting in the holder, the soft glow of the instrument panel reflecting off the windshield. She retrieved the documents and handed them over without a word. Her fingers were steady. No tremor. No hesitation. Ryan took them, glancing down briefly before passing them to one of the officers behind him. The second officer flipped through the papers quickly, the sound of plastic sleeves and folded edges cutting through the quiet. "Where are you headed tonight?" Ryan asked, shifting his weight slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Westbound," Danielle replied, her voice calm, level, carrying no more information than necessary. It was the kind of answer that satisfied the question without inviting another. Or at least, it should have. Ryan's jaw tightened just enough to be noticeable. "Westbound where?" he pressed. Danielle met his eyes, unblinking. "Delivery route," she said. The rain picked up for a moment, drumming harder against the metal surfaces around them, filling the silence that followed. In the distance, a semi-truck pulled out of the lot, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before disappearing into the dark highway. Time stretched in small increments, each second measured in breath and observation. Danielle could feel the attention around her, the quiet curiosity of strangers who had stopped what they were doing without realizing it. She remained still, grounded, as if the weight of the moment could not move her even if it tried. Behind Ryan, the second officer leaned closer to the paperwork, scanning, then scanning again, slower this time. A faint crease formed between his brows. Something did not align the way he expected it to. Danielle saw it happen before a word was spoken. She always did. Ryan noticed the hesitation too, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, his confidence adjusting rather than disappearing. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, his tone firmer now, less conversational, more directive. Danielle took one step back, then another, placing a measured distance between herself and the truck. The wet ground reflected the flashing lights beneath her boots, turning the asphalt into a shifting mirror of red and blue. She clasped her hands loosely in front of her, not defensive, not submissive, just present. The officers circled slightly, creating space, creating control. The routine was familiar, but something beneath it felt different, like a note played just slightly out of tune. Danielle lifted her gaze briefly toward the far edge of the lot, where darkness swallowed the outlines of parked vehicles and highway signs. For a fraction of a second, her eyes sharpened, focused on something unseen by anyone else. Then just as quickly, her expression returned to neutral, calm, unreadable. The rain softened again, falling into a quieter rhythm, but the tension did not leave. It settled instead, low and steady, like a current running beneath the surface, waiting for the exact moment to rise. The third officer stepped forward from the edge of the flashing lights, slower than the others, his presence quieter but heavier in a way that shifted the air around him. He was older, his uniform sitting differently on his shoulders, worn not from neglect but from years of use. Sergeant Mark Ellis. His eyes moved from Danielle to the truck, then to the scattered reflections on the pavement, taking in the entire scene before settling back on her again. Unlike the others, he did not rush. He observed. The rain softened into a thin mist, barely audible now, clinging to fabric and skin instead of striking against it. Ellis spoke without raising his voice. "What is in the trailer?" The question hung there, simple on the surface, but weighted with expectation. Danielle turned her head slightly toward the long stretch of her rig, the trailer extending behind her like a quiet statement of purpose. "Standard freight," she replied, her tone even, her posture unchanged. Ellis did not respond immediately. He glanced toward the second officer, who still held her paperwork, flipping one page back, then forward again, as if the answer might change if he looked long enough. Ryan shifted beside them, impatience tightening his stance. "We are going to take a look," he said, already stepping toward the rear of the truck as though the decision had been made long before the words were spoken. Danielle's eyes followed him, not with resistance, but with awareness. Every step he took, every movement of his hand toward the latch, every glance exchanged between the officers, she registered it all. The rest stop seemed to lean in closer, the quiet attention of strangers sharpening into something more focused now. A car door closed somewhere behind the gas pumps. A low murmur passed between two people standing near the vending machines. The world had narrowed to this moment, to this circle of light and rain and waiting. Ellis remained where he was, his gaze returning to Danielle. There was something in his expression that had not yet settled into certainty, a hesitation that had not been present in Ryan's approach. "You have been driving long tonight?" he asked, the question softer, almost conversational, but not casual. Danielle nodded once. "A few hundred miles," she said. The number did not matter. The truth was in the tone. Ellis studied her a moment longer, then looked past her shoulder, toward the highway beyond the rest stop, where headlights moved like distant stars, constant and indifferent. Ryan reached the back of the trailer and paused, one hand hovering near the handle. He turned slightly, glancing back as if expecting confirmation, or perhaps just acknowledgement. Ellis gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to move things forward. The latch clicked open, metal against metal, a sharp sound that cut through the damp air. Danielle did not react outwardly. No shift in stance. No tightening of her hands. But her eyes, for just a fraction of a second, moved again toward the far edge of the lot, toward the same dark line she had checked before. Something unseen. Something timed. Ellis noticed the glance. He did not comment on it, but the detail stayed with him, filed quietly in the part of his mind that paid attention to what others missed. The trailer door began to lift, slow, deliberate, the interior still hidden in shadow as it opened inch by inch. Rainwater slid down the edges of the metal, dripping onto the ground in soft, steady taps. Ryan stepped closer, preparing to look inside, his posture confident, assured, as though whatever he expected to find was already decided in his mind. Danielle stood where she was, the distance between her and the truck now more than physical. It felt like a line drawn across the moment itself, a boundary between assumption and reality. The air held still again, not silent, but waiting. And beneath it all, something continued to move just out of sight, just out of reach, approaching the exact second it needed to arrive. The trailer door rose higher, inch by inch, until the interior finally opened into view, a dark rectangular space framed by cold metal and dripping rain. Ryan stepped forward, lifting his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows and stretching deep into the cargo. Rows of sealed containers lined the interior, stacked with precise spacing, secured with industrial straps that had not shifted an inch. Nothing loose. Nothing obvious. Just order. Just silence. Ryan climbed up onto the edge, boots scraping lightly against the metal lip, and leaned inside, sweeping the light slowly from left to right. The beam reflected off smooth surfaces, dull plastic, reinforced edges, the kind of freight that did not tell its story easily. "Looks clean," the second officer called out, though his tone carried more uncertainty than confidence. Ryan did not respond. He moved deeper into the trailer, one hand steadying himself against the wall, the other guiding the light across each row, checking labels, scanning numbers, searching for something that would justify the tension he had already committed to. Outside, Danielle remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, but her attention had sharpened again, focused not on the trailer, but on the space beyond the lights. A faint sound drifted in from the highway, different from the usual flow of passing trucks. Lower, more controlled. Ellis heard it too. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he looked toward the road. Two sets of headlights approached in synchronized distance, not speeding, not slowing, maintaining a deliberate pace as they moved toward the rest stop entrance. Ryan stepped back toward the opening, his voice cutting through the air again. "Open one of those containers," he said, pointing toward the nearest sealed unit. The second officer hesitated for a moment, then reached for the latch, fingers working against the damp metal. The seal broke with a soft snap, and the lid lifted slowly, revealing neatly packed contents beneath, nothing out of place, nothing illegal, nothing that matched the expectation that had brought them here. Ryan's jaw tightened. He stepped down from the trailer, landing with a muted thud against the wet ground, his eyes flicking toward Danielle again, searching for a reaction that was not there. She stood as she had from the beginning, calm, present, unmoved. The approaching vehicles turned into the lot, their headlights sweeping across the scene before cutting to a controlled stop several yards away. The engines idled quietly, different from the heavy rumble of commercial trucks, smoother, deliberate. Ellis watched them carefully now, his earlier hesitation shifting into something more alert. The driver's side door of the first vehicle opened, then closed with a solid, measured sound. Footsteps followed, steady, unhurried, moving through the edge of the light. Ryan glanced over, irritation flashing across his face. "This is an active stop," he called out, his voice raised just enough to establish control. The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, it continued forward, stepping into the full wash of red and blue lights, revealing a dark jacket, a calm expression, and a presence that did not react to the authority already in place. Danielle's eyes lifted slightly, meeting the moment without surprise. Whatever had been approaching had arrived exactly when it was meant to. Ellis shifted his stance, his attention now fully divided between the unfolding scene and the officers beside him. The air changed again, subtle but undeniable, like a current redirecting beneath still water. Ryan took a step forward, ready to assert command, but something in the posture of the approaching figure slowed him, just enough to break the rhythm he had controlled until now. Rain continued to fall, quieter now, almost fading into the background as the moment reshaped itself. And in that space, between assumption and truth, the balance began to shift. The figure stepped fully into the light, rain tracing thin lines down the shoulders of a dark jacket that did not carry any visible badge, any immediate label, yet somehow held more authority than the flashing patrol lights around it. The person stopped just short of the circle formed by the officers, eyes moving once across the scene, taking in the open trailer, the scattered paperwork, the positioning of each man, and finally, Danielle. No rush, no confusion, just recognition. Ryan squared his stance, stepping forward again, reclaiming space. I said this is an active stop, he repeated, sharper now, his voice pushing against the quiet that had settled over the moment. The newcomer finally spoke, tone low, controlled, carrying easily without force. I am aware. Nothing more. No explanation. No apology. Just presence. The second vehicle's doors opened behind them. Two more individuals stepping out, their movements coordinated, precise, closing distance without drawing attention to it. Ellis watched closely now, his instincts pulling him in a different direction than before, the earlier uncertainty sharpening into awareness. Something about this was no longer routine. Ryan's gaze shifted between them, irritation mixing with something less defined. Then you know you are interfering, he said, his words firm but not as steady as they had been minutes ago. The first figure tilted their head slightly, as if measuring the statement, then glanced briefly toward Danielle again. That glance was enough. Danielle's posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way most would notice, but Ellis saw it. A subtle release of tension, a shift from waiting to readiness. Ryan did not catch it. He stepped closer, closing the gap, determined to hold control of the situation he had already built. We are conducting a lawful inspection, he continued, gesturing toward the open trailer, toward the container that had already revealed nothing. If you have business here, you can state it or step back. The rain thinned to a mist, the air cooling further, every sound now carrying with sharper clarity. The newcomer reached slowly into the inside pocket of the jacket, movement calm, deliberate, unthreatening, yet commanding attention from everyone present. Ryan's hand hovered instinctively near his belt, not drawing, not escalating, but ready. The object that emerged was small, dark, rectangular. A credential. It was held at chest level, angled just enough to catch the reflection of the patrol lights, the insignia flashing into visibility for a brief second before steadying. Ellis stepped forward half a pace, his eyes locking onto it, reading faster than the others, processing before the words were even spoken. Federal. The realization moved through him quietly but completely. Ryan leaned in, his expression tightening as he tried to focus, to confirm, to understand what he was seeing. The air seemed to pause around them, the weight of the moment settling in layers. Danielle took one step forward now, measured, controlled, closing the distance just enough to stand within the same light as the credential. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, carrying none of the tension that had filled the scene before. You should lower your lights, she said, not as a request, but as a statement of what came next. Ryan blinked, the shift catching him off guard, his earlier certainty cracking just enough to show through. The second officer looked from the badge to Danielle, then back again, confusion rising where confidence had been. Ellis exhaled slowly, the final piece settling into place in his mind. This was no longer their stop. It had never been. The engines of the arriving vehicles idled softly in the background, steady, controlled, like everything about the people who had stepped out of them. Rain continued to fall, lighter now, almost fading, as if the storm itself had decided to step back and watch what would unfold next. The flashing lights dimmed slightly as one of the officers reached back and adjusted the angle, the harsh glare softening into something less aggressive, more controlled. The sudden shift in brightness changed the entire scene, the sharp edges of tension easing into a quieter, heavier stillness. No one spoke immediately. The sound of rain, now barely more than a whisper against metal and fabric, filled the space between them. Danielle stood at the center of it, no longer positioned outside the moment, but firmly within it, her presence steady, grounded, undeniable. The credential remained visible for a second longer before being lowered, but its impact lingered in the air, reshaping everything without a single raised voice. Ryan's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the recalibration happening behind his eyes. His shoulders lowered slightly, his stance less rigid, as if the authority he had been holding had quietly slipped from his grip without resistance. He glanced toward Ellis, searching for confirmation, for direction, for anything that would anchor him back into certainty. Ellis did not rush to respond. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging what had already become clear. The second officer stepped back from the trailer, the open container forgotten, its contents no longer relevant. The scene that had felt so controlled minutes ago now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Danielle exhaled softly, a breath that did not carry relief, but completion. Her eyes moved across the officers, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity that made the moment heavier than any confrontation could have. She reached up briefly, adjusting the collar of her jacket, a small, ordinary gesture that grounded the scene in something human, something real. One of the individuals who had arrived stepped closer, speaking quietly to the first figure, their voices low enough that the words did not carry, but their tone carried intent, coordination, purpose. Ellis watched the exchange, his understanding deepening with each passing second. This had been in motion long before they arrived. Long before the lights. Long before the questions. Ryan cleared his throat, the sound louder than he intended in the quiet that surrounded them. "We were not informed," he said, his voice more measured now, stripped of the edge it had held before. Danielle turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged. "No," she replied calmly. "You were not." There was no accusation in her tone, no challenge, just a statement that settled into the space between them with quiet finality. The rest stop remained still, the distant observers now less obvious, their curiosity fading as the tension dissolved into something more difficult to interpret. A truck engine started somewhere across the lot, the low rumble blending into the background like a reminder that the world continued, indifferent to moments like this. Danielle took a small step back, creating space again, not retreating, but resetting the distance on her terms this time. The open trailer stood behind her, its contents untouched, its purpose unchanged, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. The rain slowed further, almost stopping, leaving behind only the faint drip of water from metal edges and the soft shifting of damp fabric. Ellis straightened slightly, his posture returning to a neutral stance, the role he had carried moments ago replaced by something quieter, more observant. Ryan remained still for a second longer, then lowered his gaze briefly before looking back up, the shift subtle but real. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one needed to. The moment had already said everything. And in that quiet, with the lights dimmed and the storm easing, the balance had fully, unmistakably changed. The silence held for a long second longer, then another, stretching just enough to make every small movement feel amplified, every breath noticeable in the cool night air. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but with intention, grounding herself in the moment that had finally caught up to where she had been all along. One of the agents who had arrived stepped closer to the open trailer, his eyes scanning the interior with quiet efficiency, confirming what had already been confirmed without needing to say it out loud. Another agent spoke softly into a radio, the words low and measured, relaying information that moved beyond this parking lot, beyond the flashing lights, into a network that operated far outside the reach of what had just happened here. Ryan stood where he was, his earlier certainty now replaced with something heavier, something that did not resolve quickly. He looked at Danielle again, but this time there was no assumption in his gaze, no immediate conclusion waiting to be proven. There was only recognition, slow and uncomfortable, settling into place. Ellis took a step forward, his voice calm, controlled, but different now, shaped by understanding rather than authority. "We need clarification on the scope," he said, addressing the agent who had first stepped out, his tone respectful without losing its structure. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the request, then glanced toward Danielle before responding. Ongoing operation, he said. Sensitive. Limited disclosure. The words were simple, but they carried weight, drawing a clear boundary around what could and could not be explained. Ellis accepted it without pushback, his posture adjusting to match the new reality of the situation. The second officer moved to close the container he had opened, his hands slower now, more careful, as if the act itself required a different kind of attention than before. The lid settled back into place with a soft click, the seal no longer broken, but the moment permanently marked. Danielle turned slightly, her eyes moving across the scene one last time, taking in the repositioning of each person, the subtle shifts in tone, in posture, in understanding. This was the part that always mattered most, not the reveal, not the badge, but what came after, when people had to sit with what they had assumed. Ryan finally spoke again, his voice quieter, less certain, but honest in a way it had not been earlier. We followed protocol, he said, the statement landing somewhere between explanation and defense. Danielle looked at him, her expression steady, her tone calm. Protocol is only as good as the judgment behind it, she replied. The words were not sharp, not accusatory, but they carried a clarity that left no space for dismissal. Ryan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the movement small, but real. Ellis watched the exchange, his understanding deepening further, recognizing the difference between procedure and perception, between authority and awareness. In the background, one of the agents closed the rear door of the trailer, the metal lowering slowly until it sealed with a firm, final sound. The truck stood whole again, its purpose intact, its path uninterrupted. The rest stop began to breathe again, the quiet observers turning back to their own routines, the moment dissolving outward into something that would be talked about in low voices, remembered in fragments. Danielle stepped back toward the cab, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if nothing had ever been out of place. The agents remained positioned nearby, their presence steady, watchful, ensuring that what had been set in motion continued without disruption. Ryan stepped aside, creating space without being asked, his earlier stance replaced with something more aware, more measured. Ellis gave a small nod, not to dismiss, not to command, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place, the lesson that had settled into the space between them. Danielle reached the door of her truck, her hand resting briefly on the handle, the metal cool beneath her fingers. For a moment, she paused, not because she needed to, but because the silence around her had become something worth noticing. Then, without a word, she opened the door and began to step back into the place she had always belonged, leaving behind a moment that had changed more than anyone there would fully admit. Danielle paused halfway into the cab, one foot still on the metal step, her hand resting lightly on the door frame as the night air moved around her, cooler now, quieter, as if the storm had taken the tension with it when it passed. The interior of the truck glowed softly, familiar, steady, untouched by everything that had just unfolded outside. Behind her, the agents shifted with quiet coordination, their movements efficient, purposeful, blending into the background in a way that made them almost disappear if you were not looking for them. But Ryan was still looking. He stood a few feet away, the distance no longer about control, but about understanding something he had not seen before. His hands rested at his sides now, no longer tense, no longer ready, just present. He cleared his throat again, softer this time, the sound barely carrying beyond the immediate space. "Ma'am," he said, the word different now, stripped of assumption, carrying a weight of respect that had not been there before. Danielle turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him without stepping out of her position. The movement was small, but it opened the space for what needed to be said. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that does not come from uncertainty alone, but from the realization that words matter more after the moment has already passed. "We made a call based on what we saw," he continued, his voice measured, careful. "But we did not see everything." The statement hung there, unfinished but complete in its meaning. Danielle watched him quietly, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. She did not rush to respond. She did not fill the silence. She let it settle, let it exist, the way truth often needed to before it could be understood. Ellis stood slightly behind Ryan, his posture steady, his gaze moving between them, recognizing the shift not just in the situation, but in the man beside him. The rest stop had returned to its rhythm now. Engines starting, doors closing, the distant hum of travel continuing as if nothing had happened, yet everything had. Danielle finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying clearly without force. Seeing everything takes time, she said. And sometimes, it takes listening first. There was no judgment in her tone. No edge. Just clarity. Ryan nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, absorbing the words rather than reacting to them. Understood. He replied, the single word landing with more weight than anything he had said before. One of the agents approached Danielle then, speaking quietly, a brief exchange that did not carry beyond them, but signaled the continuation of something larger than this moment. Danielle gave a small nod in return, then shifted fully into the cab, settling into the driver's seat with the same controlled ease she had carried from the beginning. Her hands rested on the wheel for a second, steady, grounded, before she adjusted the mirrors, each movement precise, familiar. Outside, Ryan stepped back another half step, creating more space, not because he was told to, but because he understood that it was his place to do so now. Ellis placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, not as correction, but as acknowledgement, a quiet signal that the moment had done what it needed to do. The truck engine turned over with a low, steady rumble, the sound filling the space in a way that felt final without being abrupt. Danielle looked forward through the windshield, the highway stretching ahead, dark and open, waiting. The flashing lights no longer dominated the scene, their presence reduced to a background flicker against the wet pavement. For a brief second, Ryan met her gaze through the glass, not as an officer addressing a driver, but as one person recognizing another. Then Danielle shifted the truck into gear, her foot easing onto the pedal, and the massive vehicle began to move forward, slow and controlled, leaving behind the circle of light and assumption that had tried to define it. The agents stepped aside smoothly, clearing the path without interruption, their work continuing in ways unseen. The rest stop returned to its quiet rhythm, but the space Danielle left behind carried something different now, something that did not fade as quickly as the rain. The truck rolled forward with a low, steady power, its tires pressing against the damp asphalt as the last reflections of red and blue lights stretched across its chrome and then slowly slipped away behind it. Danielle kept her hands firm on the wheel, her posture relaxed but precise, eyes forward, focused on the dark ribbon of highway opening ahead. The rest stopped, faded in her mirrors, shrinking into a cluster of dim lights and quiet figures, until it became just another point along the road, indistinguishable from the miles she had already traveled. Inside the cab, the world returned to its familiar rhythm, the hum of the engine, the soft vibration through the steering column, the faint scent of coffee still lingering in the air. Everything exactly as it should be. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving behind only the occasional drip from the edges of the trailer and the faint sheen of water reflecting the highway lights. Danielle adjusted her speed smoothly, merging back into the flow of distant headlights and taillights that moved like a quiet current through the night. Behind her, at the rest stop, Ryan remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the space where the truck had been. The flashing lights continued to pulse, but they felt different now, less commanding, more like a reminder of something already past. Ellis stepped beside him, hands resting calmly at his sides, his presence steady. Neither spoke right away. There was no urgency left in the scene, only the quiet weight of understanding settling into place. Ryan finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to carry more than just the moment, his shoulders easing as he looked down briefly at the wet ground beneath his boots. The reflections of the lights shimmered in the thin layer of water, shifting with every small movement. He looked back up toward the highway, where the truck had already disappeared into the dark, leaving no trace except memory. Ellis gave a small nod, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement, then turned slightly, signaling the return to routine, to reports, to whatever came next. The other officers moved quietly, closing doors, adjusting equipment, their motions subdued, their voices lower than before. The agents who had arrived were already stepping back into their vehicles, their presence receding just as smoothly as it had appeared, leaving behind no disruption, no noise, just the sense that something larger had passed through without needing to announce itself. On the highway, Danielle drove on, the lines of the road stretching endlessly ahead, illuminated by her headlights in steady intervals. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, as if the moment had been just another part of the journey, another mile marked and passed. She reached for the radio briefly, her fingers adjusting a dial with quiet familiarity, then returned her hand to the wheel. The world outside continued without pause, the night wide and open, the road carrying her forward without question. There was no need for reflection, no need for words. The lesson had already settled where it needed to, left behind in the silence of flashing lights and shifting understanding. Ahead, the highway curved gently, disappearing into the dark horizon, and Danielle followed it without hesitation, her truck moving steady and certain through the quiet space where the storm had been.